There is a hidden curve in life that most people never recognize until it arrives. It doesn't appear on any map, nor is it mentioned in the lessons of school, highlighted in calendars, or woven into the wisdom passed down by parents. Yet, at some point, often quietly and without warning, it reveals itself, and when it does, everything changes. This curve generally appears around the age of 60. On the surface, little may seem different. The body still functions, though it begins to move more slowly, carrying with it the weight of decades. Days unfold in a gentler rhythm, with less urgency and fewer storms of emotion. Outwardly, life might appear steady, almost serene. But deep within, a subtle shift begins, a pivot of the soul that redirects the entire inner compass. It is not a dramatic break, nor a sudden visible transformation. Instead, it feels like a quiet unraveling of old pursuits, as though the heart has stopped investing in the same battles. The impulse to gain approval diminishes. The hunger to prove one's worth begins to fade. Even lifelong ambitions, once burning so brightly, lose their sense of necessity. The soul starts to drift backward, not in defeat, not in retreat, but in a symbolic journey of return. It is as though it is searching for something misplaced long ago. Fragments buried under years of urgency, overlooked in the silence of unspoken sacrifices, hidden within the hollow spaces we never dared to examine. Machiavelli described this stage with clarity. The first half of life is consumed by the building of the ego, but the second half is devoted to the homecoming of the soul. That return, however, is not gentle. It arrives with pain because by the time we reach 60, the soul no longer accepts disguises, the masks we once wore to survive, to impress, or to belong. Those masks crack and fall away. It rejects pretense without hesitation. Anything artificial, forced or performed begins to feel unbearable. What remains is a single demand: truth. And truth, when it finally arrives, is rarely soft. It often means acknowledging that much of what was lived, the endless striving, the compromises, the masks, was not pure living but survival. By 60, many people encounter a peculiar sense of detachment. Life, which once felt urgent and packed with meaning, can suddenly resemble a carefully rehearsed play, with scenes acted out for an invisible audience. Outwardly, everything may seem calm, stable, perhaps even successful, but inside there arises a profound exhaustion, not of the body, but of the spirit. It is not depression, it is not despair, it is clarity, sharp and piercing, the soul's gentle yet insistent whisper: stop searching outward. What you are longing for has always lived within. At this threshold, people begin to reopen their life story. They turn the pages of their marriages, their children's journeys, their careers, their choices, their failures, and their triumphs. Old wounds resurface, not as weapons to cut again, but as fragments waiting to be understood, integrated, and finally healed. This phase becomes a symbolic cleansing, a sacred inner ritual. It is a time to open long-locked drawers within the heart, to sift through inherited fears and discard them, to forgive those who never learned to love with tenderness, and to release the heavy burden of always having to be unbreakable. It is a time to stand before the mirror and, perhaps for the first time, see oneself without camouflage. No masks, no makeup, no fabrications. For those who walk through this gate with courage, a rare treasure is uncovered. The realization that the soul does not age. The body bends, the skin changes, but the soul only grows lighter, clearer, closer to its essence. What once seemed like an inevitable ending begins to reveal itself as the beginning of another path, one deeper, gentler, freer, and more authentic than the one before. This is the hidden curve that is rarely spoken of, the secret road unmarked on any map. Some give it names: maturity, aging, the evening of life. But words cannot fully contain it. At 60, while the body slows, something within the soul accelerates, as though all that was postponed for decades suddenly steps forward, insisting on being lived. The unfinished business of the heart, the silent callings ignored in youth, rise like soft but urgent voices whispering, "Now is the time." The remarkable thing is that this transformation does not unfold in the visible world. It does not announce itself with applause or spectacle. It happens in the invisible, in the hidden chambers of the spirit, where the truest revolutions always begin. One day, without warning and without any visible reason, something shifts. You wake up and suddenly sense that certain clothes no longer fit, not in size but in meaning. Some conversations that once seemed lively now feel dull, rehearsed, and hollow. The achievements you once carried like badges of honor begin to feel heavy, almost like burdens you are tired of dragging along. It is as though the soul, after years of quiet patience, begins to stir and ask its first uncompromising questions. What still moves me? What part of me remains untouched by the weight of other people's expectations? What would I choose if I no longer had to please anyone at all? These questions are not accidents. They are not random musings of a restless mind. They are seeds of a new cycle planted long ago, now breaking through the surface because the soil of your life is finally ready. At 60, time ceases to be measured by quantity, the number of hours, the years ahead, and instead is measured by quality. The urgency that once came from deadlines, responsibilities, and outside pressures now comes from within, from the soul itself. Machiavelli described this stage with remarkable insight. He observed that after decades devoted to adaptation, achievement, and conquest, the psyche inevitably seeks reintegration, and reintegration can only take place when we create space to face what has long been forgotten or suppressed. This is when the shadow, Machiavelli's word for the unacknowledged, unlived, or abandoned aspects of ourselves, steps forward and asks to be seen. But the shadow is not evil. It is not darkness in the sense of corruption or sin. Rather, it is the collection of neglected fragments of the self, the wounded child who was never fully comforted, the passions and dreams that were set aside in order to be practical, the intuition that was silenced so we could fit neatly into the expectations of society. At 60, these neglected parts do not return to punish us. They rise again as possibilities, unclaimed pieces of our wholeness waiting to be integrated. This is why, at this stage of life, it is not uncommon to feel a sudden and almost irrational urge to change direction, to enroll in a course of study you once longed for but abandoned, to end relationships that suffocate the soul even if they seemed unshakable for decades, to begin again not at the beginning of life but precisely at the moment where the world might say it's too late. This is why so many women in particular blossom at 60. They stop apologizing for existing. They stop reducing their strength in order to appear gentle or acceptable. They stop asking permission to occupy space, to speak their truth, to live fully. A new kind of beauty begins to radiate, a beauty unrelated to youth, fashion, or physical appearance. It is the beauty of freedom, of wholeness, of authenticity. It is a beauty that unsettles those who remain trapped in superficiality, because it is too real, too raw, too unshakably honest, and those who carry it feel no need to prove themselves anymore. They do not hunger for validation, they are content to. Perhaps, as you read these words, you have already felt that something inside you has reached this turning point. Perhaps you have noticed that your old roles feel like costumes you can no longer wear, that somewhere deep within a longing stir, not for more of the same, but for something deeper, a longing to care only for what truly matters, a longing to say no without the poison of guilt, and to say yes only when the heart itself speaks. The awakening, that inner impulse, is not selfishness, it is awakening. It is the quiet birth of a new chapter, one that calls you to stop living for everyone else and begin living from within yourself. Those who face this turning point with courage discover something rare and precious, the profound peace of simply being who they are, without fear, without pretense, because at last the soul is permitted to breathe in its own rhythm again. Few people say this aloud, but many feel it in the marrow of their being when they reach this stage of life. The startling realization that much of their existence has been spent living for others, for the children who needed constant care, for the partner who leaned on their presence, for the family and its endless duties, for the career that consumed the best hours of the day, for the expectations of society that quietly dictated the rules. So much space was taken up by these demands that now, as the noise begins to recede, there is a peculiar emptiness, an unoccupied room within. But it is precisely in this emptiness that something extraordinary occurs. The soul, no longer bound by roles and responsibilities, begins to move freely. It does not crave to be useful anymore. Usefulness was the currency of the earlier chapters. Now it longs to be real. In a world intoxicated by productivity and measurable outcomes, this desire may seem strange, even rebellious. Yet the soul was never created to produce. It was created to be whole. And at 60, it finally whispers with quiet authority, "I have followed every command, I have obeyed every duty. Now it is my turn." This reversal of values can feel disorienting. It frightens some because no one prepares us for this transformation. Society paints aging in dark tones as though it is merely a process of decline and loss. But Machiavelli saw it differently. To him, this was the richest stage of life, the most symbolic, the fullest of potential. For it is here, in these later years, that the ego begins to loosen its grip. Pride fades, ambition softens, and the deeper truths of life rise to the surface. It is often during this awakening that old memories resurface, not as fleeting nostalgia, but with the weight and force of something unfinished. Childhood scenes return, faces of significant people reappear in dreams, forgotten places stir with longing. These are not mere recollections, they are signs that the soul is reorganizing its archives, sorting through the unexamined and the unresolved. It wants to know what still aches, what still cries out for closure, what has survived the passage of decades. And for this sacred work, the soul does not demand noise or attention. It does not shout. It calls for silence, deep, listening silence, because only in stillness can its voice be heard. A quiet transformation. It sighs softly. It exhales in silence. It does not arrive with thunder or spectacle, but rather with a whisper woven into the ordinary fabric of daily life. It hides in recurring dreams, in sudden waves of emotion that seem to come from nowhere, in strange longings you cannot explain. Slowly you begin to notice that some people no longer make sense in your story, that certain opinions no longer move you, that wounds you once clung to as identity no longer define who you are. It is as though the soul has finally claimed its authority, gently but firmly saying, "I am leading now." But for the soul to take its rightful place, one condition remains. You must listen. Listen to the sadness that rises uninvited. Listen to the body's plea for rest after decades of rushing. Listen to the boredom that creeps into places where once there was excitement, for these are not failures. They are signals, signs of a quiet transformation taking place within. This is not a cosmetic change, not a surface rearrangement. It is structural. It dismantles old images, dissolves outdated roles, and leaves you face to face with something you may have avoided your entire life. Your own truth. And truth, though liberating, can be startling when it strips away what is no longer real. At this turning point, many encounter spirituality in its most authentic form, not as dogma, not as ritual, not as something imposed, but as lived experience, an awareness of presence, a deepening of inner consciousness. Machiavelli once remarked, "No one becomes enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by becoming conscious of their own darkness." At 60, those words strike differently. For now, darkness is no longer feared as an enemy. It becomes a threshold, the fertile soil where something new can be born. Loneliness itself begins to shift its meaning, revealing that it was never emptiness at all, but a meeting with the essential self, a reunion with what has always been there, waiting quietly in the shadows for recognition. It is fascinating how, at 60, even language seems to change its meaning. Take the word time. It no longer equates to urgency, deadlines, or the anxious rush of tasks. Time becomes presence. You no longer measure your worth by completed lists. Instead, you measure the depth of your days by the truth carried in each moment, the sincerity of a gesture, the peace hidden in the spaces between words. Even love undergoes transformation. It is no longer the search for completion or the fulfillment of fantasy. It becomes a conscious choice, free from performance. Love stops needing display. It shows itself instead in silence, in a glance that speaks more than words, in a presence that respects space rather than invades it. To love at 60 is not to claim but to accompany, not to demand but to witness. Fear, too, begins to loosen its grip. Having lived through decades of storms, falls and risings, you have seen too much to tremble at small uncertainties. Fear still appears, but now it arrives as a reminder not of weakness, but of the strength you have already proven time and again. And so, at 60 there emerges a kind of wisdom that cannot be taught, only lived. A clarity that no book can impart because it has been carved by scars and softened by healing. It is a knowing that resides in the body, speaks through the eyes, and flows out effortlessly in gestures and words. It does not need to justify itself, it simply is. And that is precisely why this kind of wisdom unsettles the world. It disturbs those who are still acting upon the stage of the ego, clinging to roles, rehearsing performances, and confusing worth with appearance. It shakes those who equate youth with power, not realizing that a ripened soul becomes a fertile ground for creation far beyond the reach of superficial strength. For it is in this stage of life that the most luminous treasures begin to emerge, the deepest stories, the most honest counsel, the pauses that soothe and heal. But this flowering is born from endings. Only what has had the courage to die can return transformed and alive again. A fertile ground. At 60, many illusions must be surrendered. The hunger for approval, the fantasy of control, the exhausting habit of trying to save everyone, the crushing pressure to be flawless, these must be laid to rest. And when they die, something extraordinary begins to stir. Breathing itself changes. It feels as if after decades of tightness, the soul has finally thrown open a window. From this vantage, the world looks sharper, richer, more alive. Every sensation is more vivid. Every truth feels undeniable. It is no wonder that many at this stage feel a sudden call to create. Some begin to write the stories that were locked inside for decades. Others paint, sing, or craft with their hands. Many choose to walk alone, not from loneliness but from a desire to listen more deeply. Some return to study, not to achieve but to learn with joy. Others travel, not merely to see new landscapes but to encounter themselves in unfamiliar spaces. The soul, freed from its long confinement, begins to crave expression. It no longer wants to be seen for validation. It wants to be seen for the sake of truth, for the joy of being whole. And every gesture of this expression, whether a word written in a journal, a brushstroke on a canvas, or a quiet meditation in solitude, becomes a form of healing. Not the healing that medicine gives, but the kind of healing that comes from reconciliation with one's own time. At this point, the longing to run back into the past disappears. The urge to rush into the future dissolves. What remains is a steady desire to be fully present, to live the now with everything you are, without disguise, without apology for how long it took, without asking anyone's permission to begin again. There is an inner season that only blooms after 60. It does not resemble the spring of youth, noisy and restless, overflowing with haste and promises. This new season is gentler, deeper, slower, but infinitely more real. It is a quieter spring, a more mature blossoming, grown from roots that have endured countless storms and still held firm. And when it finally blooms, it does not bloom with vanity or haste. It blooms with truth. This new season carries a rhythm all its own. It no longer asks much of the body, which has already given decades of labor, but it asks deeply of the soul. It calls you to revisit the quiet agreements you once made, the words you swallowed, the compromises you accepted, the childhood promises whispered to yourself in front of the mirror. It is a time of reconciliation with the full story of your life, but unlike the reconciliations of the past, there is no bitterness now. There is no blame. Instead, there is compassion. You stop scolding yourself for what was done or left undone. You recognize, perhaps for the first time, that every earlier version of you did the best they could with the tools they had at the time. This realization does not weaken you. It liberates you. For only those who learn to forgive themselves can finally walk lightly. And by 60, lightness is no longer optional, it is essential. But this lightness is not the shallow kind that pretends nothing has ever hurt. It is a conscious lightness, one that honors pain without bowing to it. The ache still lingers, but it no longer governs. The longing still pulses, but it no longer weighs the heart down. The absences are still there, but they no longer paralyze. Machiavelli called this process late individuation, the soul's long-delayed return to itself after a lifetime of adjusting to the demands of the world. It is as though the soul, after decades of service to duty, finally declares, "Now it is my time to find myself." And what it finds is the most beautiful treasure of all. The discovery is not loud, not grand, not staged for anyone else. It is quiet. It is deep. It is true. It requires no witness, no applause, no explanation. It is simply a return to essence. At 60, this return often reveals itself in the simplest of gestures. A walk with no destination but the joy of the air against your skin. A book that unexpectedly draws tears. An old song that awakens long-buried memories. A sunset that suddenly feels like the first one you have ever seen. Or a reconnection, not with another person but with the part of yourself that has been waiting patiently inside you all along. The soul becomes tender again, touched by small things, not because it has grown fragile, but because it is finally unguarded. The armor has fallen away, the fear of feeling has dissolved. This sensitivity is not weakness, it is the refinement of strength. It is the polished result of everything endured, everything overcome, everything felt to the core. And within this sensitivity lies the doorway to a rare and quiet wisdom, the kind that does not demand to be heard but that naturally inspires those who encounter it. Beauty. By 60, there is no longer any need to convince, to prove, or to perform. You simply live in truth, with dignity, with grounded presence, and that presence radiates outward in ways words cannot capture. It touches your children, who see you differently now. It blesses your grandchildren, who may not yet understand it, but feel it in your embrace. It steadies your friends, who notice the calm in your being. It even reaches strangers, who sense something luminous in your presence. For when a soul becomes whole, when it finally returns home to itself, it does not merely change the person, it illuminates the world around it. There is a kind of beauty that only emerges when the rushing finally ends. It is a beauty that does not live in smooth skin, painted faces, or polished appearances. Instead, it appears in the softened lines of a face shaped by years, in the pauses that give weight to words, in the eyes that have seen much sorrow and much joy yet remain tender enough to still be moved. It is beauty without makeup, without filters, without effort, and precisely because it is unforced, it is the rarest kind. This beauty does not cry out for recognition. It does not demand the spotlight. It radiates quietly, like light at dawn, steady, lasting, undeniable. Often those who carry it do not even realize it, for they have spent a lifetime trying to mold themselves into shapes that never honored their true light. But around 60, something shifts. This beauty begins to surface naturally, effortlessly, when the fight against time is surrendered, when the endless chase for approval in other people's mirrors finally ends. When you begin to recognize that your story, with all its scars, choices, mistakes, and triumphs, is worthy of reverence. It is the beauty of the woman who walks alone and does not mistake her solitude for loneliness. The beauty of the man who allows himself to cry in silence and sees no weakness in his tears. The beauty of a voice that knows how to remain quiet without betraying its truth. The beauty of choices that no longer need defense or explanation. The beauty of love that expects nothing in return but still flows generously. At this turning point, the soul begins to speak its own language, and that language is presence. You discover what it truly means to be here. You begin to notice the difference between simply hearing and truly listening with the heart, between speaking and actually saying something that matters. Relationships shift too. You drift, without effort, away from what exhausts you and move toward what nourishes you. And when no one else is there, you realize something powerful: you have finally learned to keep your own company. That, at last, is freedom. When solitude ceases to mean emptiness and becomes instead the presence of your own self, when silence stops being uncomfortable and transforms into a refuge, a sanctuary, when time itself no longer feels like something to count, measure, or outrun, but like an open space to breathe, to remember, to feel, to exist more lightly. At 60, you realize there is no longer any need to explain yourself. You simply are. Those who recognize your truth will stay. Those who do not will drift away. But the loss no longer wounds, because you know now that a soul can only be recognized by another awakened soul, and in that recognition, quiet, wordless, without demand, lies the deepest connection of all. It is a connection that does not bind, does not control, does not consume. It simply allows. It feels like a meeting between two mirrors, a dance carried out in silence, a shared knowing that despite everything, a life of wholeness is not only possible, it is here. And so, when the soul finally changes direction, everything that was hidden, everything denied, forgotten, or pushed aside, begins to rise. Not to overwhelm, but to complete. When the soul changes direction, sometimes the shift arrives as softly as a breeze, so gentle you almost miss it. Other times it trembles through you like an inner earthquake, subtle yet undeniable. However it comes, it always carries the same invitation: be who you are. At last, and without fear. But to accept that invitation, letting go becomes essential. Letting go of old versions of yourself. Letting go of the stories others told about you that you carried as if they were truth. Letting go of the restless need to be useful, to be productive, to be admired, to be flawless. By 60, what matters is no longer what you do, but how you are as you do it. What matters is not the outward act, but the intention that animates it. Not the words themselves, but the soul breathing inside them. You begin to see that your greatest lessons did not come from success or recognition. They came from pain, not from the pain alone, but from how you chose to move through it. From the decisions you made even when you were bleeding inside. From the nights when you held your silence though every part of you wanted to scream. From the boundaries you finally drew after years of surrendering yourself too easily. This invisible collection of experiences becomes your true strength now. It cannot be measured in diplomas, in promotions, or in applause. It shows itself instead in the way you rise each morning despite the heaviness of yesterday, in the way you look at those you love, with eyes softened by forgiveness and humility, in the quiet way you forgive without fanfare, without needing to announce it to anyone. As the soul matures, it learns something essential: to trust itself. Not the shifting tides of others' opinions, not the fleeting promises of the outside world, but the quiet authority of its own voice. It begins to notice the signs it once ignored. It feels the body with deeper mindfulness, no longer treating it as a machine but as a companion. It honors its own cycles of rest and renewal. It knows when to speak and when to hold silence, even when the lips tremble with unsaid truth. This is not weakness. This is wisdom. This is the essence that remains when all the outer layers peel away. This is what blooms once the shell has fallen. This is what endures when you finally choose to be yourself, unguarded, unashamed, and unafraid. Machiavelli captured it with clarity. The second half of life is not about conquest, but about integration. It is the season when all the fragmented parts of you, those once split apart by necessity or fear, return to meet each other. The forgotten feminine, the silenced masculine, the wounded child, the hidden dreamer, the wise elder. They all come forward, look one another in the eye, and recognize themselves as belonging to one whole. And from that meeting, a new kind of strength is born. Not the strength that conquers or dominates, but the strength that sustains, the strength that holds, that endures, that remains, A strength so quiet it needs no spotlight, because it glows from within. This is the strength. This is the strength that carries the soul through the years without fading. It is not loud, not demanding. It asks for very little, only truth, only silence, only the courage to never abandon yourself again. There comes a moment, often quietly, when everything begins to fall into alignment, not because the external world has changed, but because something within you has finally made peace. At 60, the soul no longer seeks speed. It hungers for depth. It no longer yearns for final answers. It finds its refuge in presence. It no longer burns with the need to conquer the world. Instead, it longs for peace within its own body, peace in the smallest rhythms of daily life. This is the age when many realize that life was never truly about having possessions, titles, recognition. Life has always been about being who you are, even if no one else understands, remaining faithful to your truth, even when it is misunderstood, standing whole, even if life has broken you 1,000 times. By 60, the years have left their traces. Losses have carved their lessons. Illusions have been tested and often dissolved. The roads have shown not only their shortcuts, but also their cliffs. And yet, in the midst of all this, something remains alive. Something within you continues to breathe, to dream, to desire, not from obligation but from joy. This gentle desire to keep moving forward lightly, tenderly, is itself the proof that the soul is still vibrant, still alive. Machiavelli called this phase sacred, for it is the stage when the ego finally bows to the soul, when the outer world loses its tyranny and the inner world becomes a temple, when you discover how to walk without carrying the weight of the entire world upon your shoulders, when you at last understand that you are allowed to rest in yourself. And this resting is not laziness, not passivity. It is reconciliation, a reconciliation with your own story, with the body that carried you, with time that shaped you, with the light that inspired you, and even with the shadow that tested you. Out of this stillness, the true meaning of life begins to reveal itself. Not the version handed down by others, not the script society imposed, but the meaning you uncovered by living fully through struggle, through beauty, through survival, through awakening. If you have walked with me through these words, perhaps you have felt a quiet stirring inside. Perhaps you have recognized forgotten parts of yourself hidden in the spaces between the lines. Perhaps something that has long been asleep in you has turned its head toward the light. If so, I invite you to respond to your own soul. Write a single sentence that captures this new chapter, an inner vow, a whispered decision, a message rising from within. And if these reflections remind you of someone who may be standing at this curve in life, share it with them as a gift of recognition. And if you wish to continue walking this path of presence and wholeness with us, a place where silence is honored and every story is given room to bloom, then subscribe and stay connected. Because here, every silence is given a voice, and every life, no matter how weathered, is revealed as sacred.